So, the story that I would like to tell you tonight is a story that comes from history. It was 1918. There was a world war. There was an international flu epidemic. It was a tough time, but that was not what was on the mind of George Goetz. George Goetz was a beet farmer who lived in Lehi, Utah. He had 10 acres of beets. It was a good crop, a good cash crop, and it sold for enough most years to provide pretty well for his family. He had a large family. He and his wife had had 14 children, though half of them had died in infancy. But of the remaining seven, two of them were grown and gone with families of their own, living 65 miles away in Ogden. Two of his sons were in the armed forces, and that just left one, his youngest son, France, to help his father with the beets. And that winter came early. The snow came and the beets froze in the ground. And George and France, working all day, prying each individual beet out of the earth, could get together enough to fill a wagon load, which then they would take to the sugar factory that was not far away. It was hard work, but what else were they going to do? But then everything changed. George got a phone call from his son in Ogden saying that his son, Kenneth, 9, had contracted the flu and after only a couple of days of illness had passed away. Would it be possible for George to make the drive up to Ogden and retrieve Kenneth's body and bring it back to Lehi to be buried in the family burial plot? Of course. George and France got in their car, a Chevrolet touring car with curtains on the windows, and made the 65-mile drive in winter weather. There they saw Charles bending over the body of his son, and it was clear that Charles himself was sick, as were several other members of the family. He thanked his father for coming up to take Kenneth's body back home. And he said, "But Father, I feel certain that in only a few days you'll be coming back for me." And so George and France took Kenneth's body back to Lehi, where they built a simple wooden coffin and dug a grave and had a short service. Just a few friends and family. People were reluctant to gather in those days for fear of catching the flu. And then they went home. But what they heard when they went home was that there had been another phone call. And what Charles had said was right. He had passed away. And so there was another trip to retrieve another body, another burial, another grave dug, another casket built. And then on the way home, there was another phone call. This time it was sweet Elaine. She was 6. Another trip, another casket, another grave, another service. And finally getting home, so tired. Now, when George and France had gone to get Elaine's body, they found the mother of the family, Juliet, who was ill herself, bending over the crib of another child, begging with the Lord that to not take her. But in fact, there was another phone call. And it was Vesta, golden-haired Vesta, 8 years old. Another drive, another coffin, another grave, another service. When George got home that evening, he was almost afraid of another phone call. But there wasn't another phone call that evening, and there wasn't another phone call the next morning. And so George looked at France and said, "Well, we'd better go out to the field and see what we can salvage of the beet crop." So they got their big farm wagon and they hitched up 4 horses and they started off toward their field down Saratoga Road. And as they went along down that road, they saw their neighbors, also beet farmers, coming the other way with wagon after wagon after wagon loaded with beets. The neighbors had heard about the difficulty in the Goetz family. And so as each passed, they waved at George and greeted him. "Hi, George. So sorry, George. Tough times, George." 19 or 20 wagons in all, loaded with beets. And the last one was driven by the town joker, a young man named Jasper Rolfe, freckle-faced, always had a grin. He waved and he said, "That's the last of them, George." George waved back. And then with a sigh, he turned to France and he said, "I'm happy for our neighbors that they got their beets in. I sure wish that was all of ours." And then they were at the beet field. They turned the wagon into the field. France jumped down off the wagon seat and opened up the gate, and George drove into the field. And he surveyed those 10 acres. He looked from right to left, from left to right. There wasn't a beet in sight, but just a pile of beet tops near the fence. And then it hit him. All those wagons that he'd passed. They were his neighbors' wagons, and they were his neighbors, but they weren't his neighbors' beets. They were his beets, harvested by his neighbors for him. And then George Goats, more than 6 feet tall, a strong, rugged, sturdy farmer. He sat down on that pile of beet tops and he wept and wept and wept. And then he turned his eyes heavenward and he said, "Thank you, Lord, for such good neighbors." And that is the story from 1918, a story of George Goats and his beets.